Welcome to New Beacon Books. My name is Michael LaRose, and I'm one of the directors here. Abdul Alkalimat is a longtime friend of New Beacon. We met in the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books from 1982 to 1995. And we also had a connection with the people that were involved in that bookshop globally, a network of people who had similar ideas and were similarly in struggle. This year, New Beacon is going to celebrate 60 years of existence. And we welcome you to all the celebrations we're going to have between now and December. And our event today with Abdul, an important sharing of knowledge and sharing of strategy. And we need it in these times. There's a number of publications that Abdul and his group are part of and have produced. And some we have tonight. And there are more. But these are the ones that we can show you this evening. Let me tell you about Abdul. Abdul Alkalimat is an author, activist, and professor of African American Studies at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Is that how you say it? Champaign?
Yeah.
Urbana-Champaign. His many titles include Malcolm X for Beginners and the History of Black Studies. He is currently working with the Southern Workers Assembly, and we've invited him here tonight as part of our 60th anniversary celebrations. Please welcome Abdul Alkalimat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. It's always a pleasure to be here in London, especially at New Beacon Bookstore. We're all part of a global struggle. And particularly at this moment, it's important to have global conversations. They're having global conversations. We need to have global conversations. We all know the crisis is intensifying. What I hope to do in this brief talk that leads to, I hope, a conversation is to lay out a framework that helps you to understand how we're approaching this. And hopefully you can think about how you think you should approach it in your circumstance. And then we can share this perspective. I want to address two key questions. One is, what is the nature of the crisis we're facing? And then secondly, what resistance is being waged? So on the crisis. In dealing with the United States, it's important to realize that from the very beginning, the United States was established as a white nationalist country. The founding fathers, even the abolitionists who were against slavery, meant the country to be for white people. That means European descendants. But it's hard to say just European descendants because some of Europeans weren't considered to be part of that white experience, the Irish, the Italians. But that's how it turned out because of the structure of racism in the United States, that European immigrants became white people in the United States. So there's the paradox of people thinking the abolitionists were for first-class citizenship for African Americans. They weren't. But after slavery, we then have two stages. There's de jure segregation, that is segregation by law. And then we have now de facto segregation, the reality of it without it being legally sanctioned. But it's the practice of the country. It remains a segregated society in many respects. But here's what's happening right now. The country is becoming black and brown. Currently, for people under the age of 18, 49% are not white. Think about that. Workers between the ages of 18 and 34, again, 49% are not white. The demographers say that by 2045, that's less than 20 years from now, the country will not be majority white. So we're really at the last stage of this white nationalist thinking. So when Trump says, "Make America great again," the truth of the matter is, from the standpoint of being a white country, it never has been great. But what we put forward for people when we talk to, for example, I gave a talk recently in Pittsfield, Illinois, which is in Pike County, a rural small town. And this was with Republican ex-military people, retired people. And I told them, I said, "I believe make America great again. I'm for that." And they were surprised. And I said, "But here's the thing. When you think about slavery, you have to ask yourself the question, were the slave owners great? Or were the freedom seekers and the freedom fighters great? Was the Union Army great or was the Confederate Army great?" In other words, there's a question about the struggle over history. That's the same question you all got to raise about this country here. There are aspects of it that were great. The freedom struggle, the people who wanted the society that we all might want versus the people who wanted the society that continues to oppress and exploit us. So this whole question of MAGA is really an important, it's like what the Cubans call the battle of ideas. And unfortunately, one of the things I'll say is that people often who have an ideological position of being progressive write off the majority of the population because the media presents it as the American people, when the reality exists that the majority of people are really with us. And so we have to engage in a struggle and a discussion. And that's something that we have to remind ourselves of and participate in. Now, also there's this question of the police. Now, there's a link between Mississippi and Minneapolis. If you think about slavery, there were things called the slave patrols. These were people who were organized to search out the freedom seekers, the people who were escaping from slavery. That's really the beginning of the police system in the United States. So then you have today in Minneapolis, as probably you all have heard about, ICE, the organization of the US government that really was assigned to protect the borders, to stop immigrants. And so they had a military frame of mind, and a military frame of mind, which meant that in the military, you shoot to kill the enemy. So that's how they were organized. But now they've domesticated them and brought them to Minneapolis. And so what you see in Minneapolis is turning the American people into the perspective of these people, treating them as if they were the immigrants. And one of the interesting things that happened in Minneapolis is it wasn't just black people that were being killed. Now they're shooting down white people. That created a turning point. And the community of Minneapolis responded in ways that were not anticipated. And I'll talk about that later when I talk about the resistance. All of this is happening in the context of the economic crisis, in what is now being called a K economy. You know, the letter K has these two vectors, one going up, one going down. In other words, polarization. The so-called big, beautiful bill that Trump and the Republicans passed in Congress exacerbated this polarization. The minimum wage in the United States, the federal minimum wage, is $4.25. How much is that in British money?
£2.
Okay, £3. That's for an hour's work. My Oyster card runs out too often for me. So I don't even, I don't keep up with how much it is, but I do know that I ran out and they put me in the minus. I had to scurry to, top it off. One of the crises is also the question of health care. The ACA, or what's called the Obamacare bill, established health care in the private sector, but provided subsidy. So it wasn't health care for all. It was supporting the insurance companies, but providing federal money to enable people to get those policies. When they refused to support continuing those subsidies, now several million people have lost their health care. So that means no health care. Now, this economic polarization really is part of the change in the global economy since World War II. See, World War II represented a great period of industrialization. And industrialization brought real change for African Americans, really for everybody. But African Americans were able to migrate from the rural agricultural South to the urban industrial North. And that meant that you could then, because of the demand for labor, you could then get a factory job or a job in the city where you were making more money. So towns like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Pittsburgh, these are big industrial cities that developed large Black populations. Well, what has happened in the new economic development is the deindustrialization of these very cities. And that is with the rise of industrialization in Japan and China. The US capitalists thought that they could use Chinese labor because they weren't going to use American labor. But now the Chinese have more robots than anybody else in the world. The Chinese are adopting the new economic model of the 21st century. And so there's a crisis. Because here's the crisis. With the new technology, you can continue to produce. But if you're not hiring people and paying people a wage, they're not going to buy what is being produced. Robots don't buy anything. That means that you have this crisis of realization, because it's not just the production that produces profits for capitalists, it's the distribution and sales of those various things being produced. So we have this growing crisis that faces systemic crisis that faces the capitalist system. Adopting the new technologies, replacing human labor, reduces the source of profits, because the only profits that come from a capitalist economy is the exploitation of labor. Now, of course, this is not just happening to Black people or to Latinos. This is happening to white people as well, which is a typical crisis that faces the American situation. So how does the capitalist control the thinking and the orientation of white workers, which has always been the strategic goal to keep the working class separated to prevent the struggle from developing against the capitalists? What's happening now is, you would call it ethnic cleansing, or the attack on DEI. To give you several examples of this, the National Park Service in the United States runs national parks throughout the country. As a result of the 60s, there was a re-examination of slavery. So national parks that used to just promote the description of the plantation big house suddenly was then extended to include the slave quarters and the full understanding of what was happening on that plantation. The new policies mean that the discussion of slavery is removed. There was a whole exhibit in Philadelphia which included a discussion of George Washington being a slave owner. So was his wife. They inherited these slaves, etc. They took that down to protect George from being known as a slave owner. We're fighting this because the struggle around slavery and the remembrance of slavery, memory, is an important part of understanding what's going on in the country today. See, one of the things, when DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, when he then made his moves, and I told people, I give a shout out to him, I give him some respect. Maybe people, what? You respect this guy? I said, look, when the devil steps out of the shadows, that wake everybody up. In other words, some of us are regarded as some kind of strange radicals, always running off at the mouth, complaining about the society. Now everybody has to face what's going on. Tell you an example of what's happening in Florida today. All sociology, introduction to sociology textbooks have been deemed illegal. They have adopted at the state level, they've adopted it as an online textbook that was 700 some pages. They have edited it down to 200 and some pages. All discussion of racial and ethnic groups have been removed. All discussion of gender has been removed. All discussion of stratification has been removed, if you can imagine that. So there's a struggle over controlling the consciousness of people, and therefore every battlefront becomes important. Libraries, schools, the media. So these DEI policies, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is really what part of the struggle is about. And again, what's interesting is that there are a lot of people, like I'm an activist in Black Studies. Black Studies was a battlefront of the Black Power movement, 1966, Black Power. And we thought we were creating a new society, a new set of institutions. We did not understand at that moment how powerful institutions were. So once we fought our way in, right, they put the whammy on people and turned them into who they were. Because once you got in, you had to get tenure and you had to get grants. And you also had to avoid the kind of, it's really incredible. They call them, what's that expression? Those tiny little things. I'm having a senior moment. Minimum, I'll think of it later. Okay. So anyway, DEI attacks. But of course, everybody today knows we're at war. And that's really the context for all of this crisis coming together. Because you could call it a war of choice. You could also call it a war that reflects the systemic orientation of imperialism, which is war-oriented, and war has been oriented in the United States since its inception. So it's new, and yet it's part of the norm. The crisis that the capitalists face are the same crisis that we face, the environmental crisis. This puts us outside of the class struggle. It puts us in the struggle for the survival of the planet, for the survival of humanity. But it's important to understand what this MAGA philosophy leads to. It's leading to the reestablishment of the Monroe Doctrine. So there's a new sort of isolationism that's developing, where the United States is claiming that region of the world, South America, North America, the Caribbean, as its territory, basically assigning Europe to Russia and whatever else NATO can end up being, and then China for Asia. So we're really at a period where, with the end of international law from the standpoint of the United States, and this regional organization, we're just at the beginning, and I really want to stress this, we're at the beginning of a barbaric stage of human history. You know, it's easy to say phrases like gunboat diplomacy and so on. I mean, you know, what does that mean? Gunboat, that minimizes the situation. No, this is an era of global barbarism where no rules apply. And that means all of us have to really begin to think seriously about the relative security that we all face. See, everybody in London under a certain age feels secure. Ukraine is over there. You know, if you're over a certain age, you remember when the bombs were dropping. I don't know, is there anybody still left? Hell, I'm old enough, so I know there's some people. Okay, so, but that's something we should all think about. The world crisis is heading our way. And therefore, we have to pay attention to what we can do, not only to prevent it, but to survive when it happens. In Minneapolis, the community began to respond because of the immigrants who were hiding in their houses because they didn't want to come out facing ICE. People then started organizing food delivery. There was a whole delegation of about 300 people that went through neighborhoods singing songs, reaching out. So we all have to begin to think about new ways. Kate and I, my wife, we do deep water aerobics. Mostly middle-class white women and me. They started participating in demonstrations. These are middle-class white women who had never been involved in any demonstrations, who now are marching. So we're entering into a new period, is what I'm trying to say. Now, in addition, we have to think about not only the question of Venezuela, but Cuba. See, this is going to be a very important moment because it's been relatively comfortable for all of us who support the Cuban Revolution. But what's going to happen when the attack occurs? What are we going to do? How is that going to impact, for example, our understanding of what's going on in the Caribbean? In other words, Jamaica, Trinidad, bowing to the demands of MAGA. So we all have to think about this, not in relationship to those people over there, but to us. This is us. You know, when Fidel said we are Africans when he talked to the Cuban people, we have to also, we are all Cubans. Now, the other thing, of course, is the whole question of morality. And this is where what the Epstein thing, the prostitution and sexual violence against teenagers and 10 and 9-year-old girls. And the American population was, even the MAGA people were putting pressure for full disclosure of the Epstein files. This war has taken the Epstein files off the front pages. Not unlike war protecting Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. So we have to really pay attention to the continuing struggle of polarization. Because if you look at the polls, there's not one issue other than maybe the question of borders that the American public agrees with Trump on. Every issue, it's 50% plus against him, 60% against him, 70 or 80% against him. So the majority of people in the country, in terms of opinions, are against what's going on. There's a man named Wilkerson who was the chief of staff to Colin Powell, high-ranking military guy. He's being interviewed about the situation having to do with the coming election in November. And he says, my professional colleagues, and obviously that means high-ranking military people, and even, he said, some liberals like Ralph Nader are meeting to discuss what will happen when Trump tries to prevent the midterm elections from happening. Now, you know, We, in this little radical discussion, might say something like that, and the CNN and so on would just say, well, this is radical, this is ridiculous, this is, extremist, etc. This is part of the mainstream. And the man went further and said he thinks 50% of the military will agree not to follow illegal orders. So what I'm saying is the future might not be what we think as the normal course of events. We're heading into uncharted waters here for serious confrontation. The man's words came out of his mouth, civil war. Okay, that's about the crisis. Now the resistance.
Do I need to get out?
Yeah, so everybody could see. We want to talk just for a moment about mass protests. It's often thought that there's not a lot of resistance. I'm going to walk you through some of this. In 2011, a movement started called Occupy Wall Street. It took place in 100 cities in the United States. In 2013, 2 years later, Black Lives Matter jumped in over 200 cities in the United States. It became global. It was taken up here in London, all over the world. Black Lives Matter. Then, 4 years later, what was called the Me Too movement, this is a women's movement, jumped. It too impacted the world. There were 100,000 women in Chicago alone that marched. Then in 2024, students began to occupy and create camps on campuses in support of Palestinian struggle against Israeli genocide, forcing the hand of universities to bring the police back onto campus. Again, the polarization of society, because that helped to then do what? Give birth to a new radicalism among students. Then, of course, the movement called No King's Day, a direct response to Trump. First King's Day, No King's Day, 5 million people were in the street. Second King's Day, 7 million people were in the street. Then, of course, Minneapolis. ICE out. First, the struggle was in Los Angeles. Then the struggle was in Chicago. Now the struggle in Minneapolis and Portland, many other cities in the United States. We don't know everything because the main news outlets are not reporting. Like the young man that was killed before the two people in Minneapolis. The third King's Day is March 28th. There will be 9 or 10 million people in the street. Thank you. The point that we're trying to make is that there is a growing and developing mass involvement in resistance. I've already told you about the polls that are taken, the opinion polls. But in addition to those anti-Trump opinions, there's growing sentiment against capitalism and a growing sentiment, particularly among young people, for socialism. Now, of course, we know we haven't gotten to definitions. What the hell is capitalism? What the hell is socialism? But the point is that people are expressing, and particularly young people and Black people are expressing opinions against what they have experienced. We have yet to have the kind of debate and study among development of radicalism that can actually change power by having an alternative to the existing system. But we certainly have the development of opposition to what's going on. And that's a real step forward. Now, the media in the United States is almost totally captured and becomes a mouthpiece of the State Department, of the US government. You know, it's like lies and lies and more bullshit and more lies. That's what we hear. I'm hearing a little bit of it on BBC too, by the way.
Absolutely.
The one public TV broadcast called MS Now does at least comment on the illegality of the Iran aggression. Then there's another program called Democracy Now, which is sort of a social democrat radical report and radical of the New York Times. But you hear some voices that you wouldn't hear any other way. And then, of course, there's whatever else is online. There's tremendous resources online. And one of the issues, of course, is that there's so much online that we don't have yet ways of filtering it so that there's a developing consensus about radicalism. We're still in our respective camps. And so one of the things I often ask people is, what are you reading? What are you looking at? You know, trying to find something better than what I got already. Another interesting thing that's happening in terms of resistance is that the election that's coming up in November, I think you all have election in May. In November, is that there are what are called swing districts in the United States. What happens in the United States is there are two houses of Congress. Senators are elected every 6 years. People in the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. So coming up in 26 November, the entire House of Representatives will be up for a re-election. So it's a very important election. There are about 34 swing districts that are in play. And by that, it's what I mean by swing districts is it's not clear. There are no safe seats in those swing districts. And many Republicans are deciding not to run again. Some other Republicans are deciding to maybe not support Trump because they're risking their own seat in Congress. So there's a lot going on here. But in terms of political organizations, the left in the United States, what's left of the left, is tailing spontaneity. In other words, the No King's Day was organized by the Democratic Party. The left then responds. But the left is not leading. And of course, by the left, what I'm talking about are people who are the remnants of the legacy of Third International. In other words, the Communist Party, the Trotskyite organizations, the organized left in that sense. But then there's something called the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. You probably heard about the election of Mamdani as mayor of New York City, or the AOC in Congress. These are the people who represent DSA. And it's kind of a social movement left. And one of the interesting things about the DSA is that the social movement is that social movements are the ebb and flow. So you can get social movement activists to get involved and then it recedes. And then it gets involved and then it recedes. And so the question of DSA is, what is the organized basis to confront power, not just the election? So right now, Mamdani is facing, New York is the center of capitalism in the United States. So Mamdani is going to face the brutal reality of capitalism. So the question is, to what extent are the thousands of people that supported him going to turn into an organization that can actually confront power? Um, the Black Liberation Movement is very weak, particularly on United Front activity. Give you a couple of examples. In Chicago, the election of Harold Washington, the black mayor, the first black mayor of the city, was a great United Front effort led by black people, anchored in the working class, joined by the middle class, alliances with the Latino community, and what were called lakefront liberals. That's just part of the geography of the city, Lake Michigan. Today, black middle class thinks they still should be running the city. And Latinos' population has been growing and is expressing an interest in their leadership, similar to the history of the Irish versus the Polish. The Irish had control of Chicago. The Poles thought it was their turn, and they got beaten back. So now black people are not uniting with this Latino development in Chicago, so there's struggles. But part of that is exacerbated by the fact that under Obama, something like 50 schools were closed in Chicago, in black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. And you know, a school is a building, it's an anchor to a community and so on. They closed them. But now, because of new immigration, they have reopened some of those buildings to house the new immigrants. So the black community gets pissed in saying, you done closed our school, now you're opening this school up for people who don't even speak English. So, and with the absence of a progressive organization to work the relationship between the community and the new arrivals, then you get this hostility and this contradiction. So there are many contradictions that are developing out of this current policy that the Trump administration is pursuing. And this has a lot to do with the fact that people that, like in Texas, Governor Abbott, putting people on buses and just sending them to a city. And then suddenly the city has a crisis. What are you going to do with these people? And so they're trying to work out a place for them to stay, et cetera. But at the same time, that causes contradictions because of the past practice of the attacks on the very community where you're trying to locate people. This leads, of course, to talk about the elections that in November. Now, what's happening in the United States is several things in anticipation of this election. There have been 2 governors' elections, both won by Democrats. There have been other what are called by-elections here, I think, that have been won by Democrats, including in areas that have been won by Trump by 30 points, now being won by Democrats by 17 or 20 points. Big swings. So the Republicans are worried. And Trump is worried because if the House is taken by the Democrats, the possibility he will be impeached again. And if the Senate is won, and something like a third of the Senate is up for votes, if the Senate is won, then they can actually impeach him and throw him out of office. But of course, that would lead to J.D. Vance becoming the president. So, you know, we got to deal with all that. Of course, we could impeach him too, but the first thing they did was reapportionment to try to redraw the districts in what is called gerrymandering. So you can redraw the districts so that it appears that it become a safe seat for whatever party you're interested in. But that assumes one important thing, that the non-voter will remain a non-voter. During Trump's election, you have to think of that election in thirds. 1/3 voted for Trump. 1/3 voted for Harris. This is of the electorate. 1/3 didn't vote. So the non-voter is the key to the future elections. What happened for Obama is a non-voting black person voted. So the question is whether or not the motivation is going to be, and the Democrats providing an alternative, because it's almost like the Democrats made a mistake, an error, in allowing Biden to stay in the race as long as he did. and then not have a primary, but just appoint Harris. And even if she had won the primary, that would have given her momentum. It'd be hard enough to just vote a black woman into being the president under almost any circumstances in the United States. Now, one of the things that is part of this whole process is the presidential election in November of 28. And one of the important moments is when the UAW president, that's United Auto Workers Union, announced the possibility of having a general strike in 28. This really plays on the fact that there's going to be a great groundswell of struggle coming out of the working class. Now, let me just explain this point. Historically, the working class in the United States has been, the highest level of unionization was in the 1950s, when 30 to 35% of workers were in unions. That's the highest it's ever been. Today, it's like 10%. And the struggle is that the large-scale factories, where it's been the historic base of the trade union movement, the historic base of the left, is not there anymore. And so what you've got is the young people who are now working in Amazon, who are working in Starbucks and so on, and they're trade union struggles. But what the ruling class did was, coming out of the 1930s, is they said, well, how can we prevent a working class movement from developing? So progressives in the Democratic Party got a law passed called the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act established the process by which you could become a union. And so you had to have an election, and the election of the workers in any given workplace, any single workplace, would then, if you won the election, you then had the right to try to get a contract. And of course, that meant you were then straight up in opposition to the owners of the plant you were working in. But what it had was the impact of separating workers from each other. So it meant you were in your plant versus some other plant. You might be making more money than them, although you might be in a more dangerous situation than them. But it fractured the working class from being a movement of workers to being a struggle of plant by plant, industry by industry. So the idea of calling a general strike is to reunite all workers as part of a class. And so the UAW is saying to all the trade unions, organize your contract negotiations to come due May of 2028. And so we can have then a broad response of the working class against this MAGA terror that's striking the country. And that would be in the spring before the fall election in November of 2028. And several national unions are beginning to do that. Nurses, teachers, others. Now, the trade union movement is split. Teamsters are with the Republicans. Many others are with the Democrats. But the struggle is, how do you get beyond the Democrats? Because of the way in which unions are tied in financially with the Democratic Party. So we're working with an organization called the Southern Workers Assembly. And I just want to tell you what our strategy is, and then we can have a conversation. The most unorganized section of the country is in the South. The South is still the largest region where Black people are located. It's where the greatest suffering and oppression and impoverishment of workers exists. It's where you have the greatest right to work states. What that means in the United States is that even if you have a union, you don't need to join the union to get all the benefits, which of course means that people, don't want to join a union, you don't have to pay dues, but you can still get the benefits. So that has a dampening effect on unions. And in many places, there are actually laws, state laws against public sector workers being in unions. That means anybody that works for the government. So sanitation workers for the city, all kinds of workers, you can't unionize. So in the Southern Workers Assembly, what we're trying to do is have a much more social justice orientation to building a workers' movement. The strategy is to organize workplace committees in multiple locations so that when we have any attempt to unionize, it's not one plant, but it's multiple plants. And the orientation is not just to the local leadership, it's the corporate leadership. Because what we're trying to do is develop class consciousness. What we talk about is there are 3 levels of consciousness. One is me consciousness. Your own health, your own, it's like when you get on an airplane, and it says, before you can help somebody, put your own mask on. So you have to take care of family. You have to take care of, me consciousness. Then there's we consciousness, your neighborhood, your individual workplace, etc. But then there's class consciousness. That's an abstraction that you have to have that helps you understand you're in unity with a broad group of people who are in opposition to the rulers of society. So that requires a higher level of consciousness to get to class consciousness. And that is the precondition for the kind of collective social action that we're trying to develop. So these workplace committees in any given city, in multiple places, come together to form a workers' assembly. You might even call it a Soviet. So a workers' assembly. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a workers' movement. And right now in the United States, in the South, we've got 25 assemblies in 8 states. And in 27, we're going to be calling a Congress of Workers in the South. And so we anticipate that 1,000 plus workers will gather in the South to then create more workplace committees and more assemblies. And the whole idea, what's interesting is that what workers need is the collective consciousness and positive attitude toward power. Now, the right wing in the United States developed power at the local level in school boards and library boards and all kinds of local communities before developing at a higher level, and now they have a caucus in Congress. We don't have that. Many people on the left are alienated from the bourgeois state. To legitimate the state, to vote that way, is just to participate in the bourgeois legitimization of their control of society. And we have a different orientation. In other words, the question is, how can workers prepare to take power? How can workers prepare to have a program of transformation? That's really what we're talking about. Because ultimately, we're facing the possibility of disorder and chaos in society because the rulers are no longer abiding by traditional practices or law. But we have a chance because the majority of people are thinking, are opinionating with us. So even though I talked about the crisis, I just want to say I'm an optimist. I think we can win. And that's why I hope to hear what you have to say about your thoughts about the crisis and about how we can win. So thank you for listening. So, yes. Oh, wait a minute. We gotta. Wait, no.
Thank you. I I'm grateful for the explanation that you've given in terms of joining some important dots to help sharpen the global picture that is evolving. Going back to something you mentioned early on regarding that the reshaping of the global picture in terms of what's happening in the North America, South America, the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe. I wonder what your thoughts are, particularly on the Americas and the Latin American Caribbean region. As we are now, a lot of the Caribbean countries are accepting deportees for a fee, presumably. We don't know, most of the people don't know what the terms are. Elon Musk is talking about Ghana being a wonderful place to create his new uh, idea. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has abandoned the population and has said, you know, I am with America. Many Caribbean leaders have remained a bit quieter and said, you know, we'll do what you say. Can I have my visa back? I'd be interested in your thoughts, the extent to which you could put a little bit more your ideas in terms of that area in particular and what's evolving with Cuba, because that's also approaching a crisis. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that question. And it's a challenging question because we're at the beginning of something. And the response to Trump and the attempt to change the Monroe Doctrine into a Donroe Doctrine and the subordination of countries raises important historical questions. The one to begin, the first question, of course, is the need for the people in the Caribbean region to reconsider unification and the struggle to unite, which of course begins with the struggle internally in every given country, because classes collaborate. And so that's the first question. And that, of course, involves this whole question of Cuba. Because what Cuba was doing, for example, with Jamaica in the healthcare industry, represented the possibility of developing unity based on what each country could contribute. You can't have a common market trading sugar for sugar. You know, you have to have some level of diversification. You have to. That's a long historical process that is not immediate. It's not just a policy a government can pass a law about. But that's the first strategic question. So if you're a young person active in the Caribbean or active anywhere in the world as part of the diaspora, thinking of the Caribbean as one place is critical. I think, secondly, the importance of people who are in the diasporas of the Caribbean need to think about participating in the transformation of US politics, so that this election in November is critical, so that the struggle around Kamala or any other person in the Caribbean is also a struggle that has to take place within the diaspora of each of these countries. So how many people from Trinidad are going to vote for the Republicans? How many people who are Jamaican descendants, et cetera, are going to vote for the Republicans? In other words, we have to be clear about that. We know, for example, that the Cubans in the United States are heavily in support of the coming attack on Cuba. So the diasporas inside the United States, the Haitians, et cetera, all have to deal with that question. And then third, I think the importance of really imagining a world beyond this barbarism that's going on. That's a very interesting thing. I mean, we're taught to accept dystopia. we're taught to accept disaster. You know, the media, the movies, you know, science fiction is not about the future of wonderful science. You know, it's about horror. And so that's normal. And it then appears in popular culture. It's what hip hop reflects, you know, kind of a negative thing, et cetera. We have to begin to imagine the possibilities of life that are without the contradictions that we're facing. Because if we can't imagine it, we can't have it. We have to imagine the possibility that we can solve the problems that we face. And I say that whether or not it's on just a moral basis, be kind to your neighbor, you know, or whether it's a political economy where we want to talk about whatever socialism might be, or forget that word, whatever post-capitalism can be. In other words, whatever language we can invent that helps us understand the possibility of a future. But I think my main answer as somebody in the United States, we have to stop the Republicans and we have to stop MAGA. Now, the day after that, we have to stop the Democrats.
That's right. That's right.
But it's a two-step, you know.
Yeah.
But thank you for the question. Yeah. Oh. Yes, those are my instructions.
Just talking into that. Okay, right. Hello. Thanks so much, Abdul, for that. And Kate, thank you. Speaking of first stopping MAGA, then stopping the Democrats, is it, can we use the Democrats to stop MAGA? And I asked this with James Tallarico, who people talk about a lot in mind, and I ask it also with Jasmine Crockett, who people, you know, talk about a lot as two Democrats who are kind of making waves in a way. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very important question because Democrats are a big tent. There's all kinds of people in the Democratic Party. So it's really a local question. It's not a national question. So that in New York, they had Mamdani. And Texas has various people. So it's a local question. But the United States is structured around a two-party system. And there's little possibility until there's something in the political science literature is called a critical election, when it's possible that a new party structure or a change will emerge. There was something several years ago called a Labor Party. It was really taking off, but it could not separate itself from the Democrats in running candidates against the Democrats. So we're now in a period of time where if it's possible to run as an independent, if it's possible to run as DSA, or if it's necessary to run in the Democratic Party. I mean, we all remember Jesse Jackson's campaigns in the Democratic Party. So it's what is possible. And that, it seems to me, is the real problem of not having a center of consensus building on the part of the left. Now, I don't want to be, you know, idealist about it. I mean, I know there are real contradictions that why the left, whatever that word means in general terms, doesn't come together. But the fact that we do have real progress being made, I mean, there's something like 150 or more DSA elected officials in the United States. There are DSA people in Congress. There are independents in Congress. Bernie Sanders is one of them. But the way that the US government is structured, like in the House of Representatives, it's a two-party structure. So whoever is elected as Speaker of the House, which is the dominant party membership in the House, that person determines committee representation and who's going to be chair of a committee. So it's about power. So even if you're an independent, you caucus with one of the two parties. You don't go off by yourself. Now the Republicans have something called a Freedom Caucus. Those are the fascists. But there's a number of people. Now we've got a Black Caucus, but the Black Caucus is not the cutting edge of representation of the Black liberation movement. This more represents the social forces of the Black middle class, negotiating its role in the power structure and in the economy, which means that on any given number of issues, it's very progressive. But on other issues like the war or maybe even Cuba, they may not have exactly a progressive position. So it's an important question you raise. And it's, in other words, my answer is that it's not the Democratic Party. It's your local possibility, which might include being a Democrat. It might include being an independent. In other words, it's like the Green Party here. I understand something interesting happened in Manchester. I don't know whether that represents everybody in the Green Party, but it sounded to me like DSA in the United States. In other words, here's an individual who represents a tendency that should be embraced. It might not be everything, but the way politics works is it's the art of the possible. It's not just the art of the impossible. I believe in both. I'm an impossible guy, but I'm also, my head is in the impossible, my feet are on the ground in terms of the possible. Yeah.
And how is the Electoral College impacting on all of that? Because to me, this is
Yes.
really important.
Yes, the question is, how is the Electoral College? One of the interesting things about the United States is the popular election does not elect the president. But the way in which the country is organized, electors are elected. And these electors then vote. And one of the ways in which the Trump administration is organizing the possibility of controlling the midterms and then certainly the presidential election is that the state legislatures and the governor validates the voting of the Electoral College. So he's trying to organize the Republican governors and the Republican state legislators to refuse to legitimate the electors of the Electoral College that represent the Democrats. So even if the Democrats have the popular vote, even if the Democrats have the electors, Trump is trying to create a crisis in the economy, in the political system, to prevent those votes from then electing the president. So I mentioned the man Wilkerson, who was with Colin Powell. They're talking about that possibility. That that the Republican candidate would not be elected, but the governors, et cetera, would stop the election from being certified. They would use ICE to move in, whether or not it's surrounding the polls to prevent people from voting. And they're trying now to create a national law that requires ID identification, et cetera, to be able to register to vote, et cetera, which is against the law because the elections are actually state-run in the United States. But so if that happens, and that's where Wilkerson is saying there's going to be a split in the military. See, this kind of action hasn't happened in the United States. Wars are elsewhere. We're the center of democracy. That's the logic that's been put in people's heads. But we're heading toward a serious situation. Yes.
I want to ask.
Oh, yeah.
I'm from the U.S. as well, visiting friends, and I'm from Louisiana originally, a native of Mississippi. So this is the amen corner over here.
Okay.
And so I wanted to know, my theory about what we're going through as a country. We know that we went through Reconstruction, and then there was redemption, And I guess there are those that would argue we've had multiple reconstructions and multiple redemptive periods. And so that's the way I've tried to look at this period, that if we can get through this redemption, that maybe on the other side will be some sort of universal health care, something that looks like the DSA. And so I wanted to know your opinion on that. And then my other question was, I'm having a senior moment too. I'll be 60 this year, like the bookstore. So if I think of it, I'll tell you about it. Oh, I'm sorry. Just leave it on the table. Thank you.
I think I believe in the old idea that it's darkest before the dawn. And so history does have these swings back and forth. But I think we need to think hard about that, because some people, for example, have this idea of the future being the recreation of the past. So that, for example, we'll go back to work again. The factories will start up again. We can recover the life that people had at a certain time. I don't think that's true. So this whole idea of actually trying to figure out what is capitalism and what is after capitalism. For example, if a society can produce enough goods and services for everybody, even though large sections of the population are not working, then we need to figure out how to distribute that so that people can have a decent life. You know, John LaRose, the founder of this bookstore, used to always talk about the workday and how to think about the possibility of not having to work 40 hours a week in order to, you know, in the United States, there was a whole movement, 30 for 40. Work 30 hours, get paid for 40. There's a whole question of what is the division of labor of a civilized society. How many people have to work in producing goods that robots can do? How many people should be caring for children and caring for the elderly and providing cultural opportunities for everybody? I mean, again, thinking about what the world could be like if we, so my whole point about the future is we're not going back to the past.
Right.
America will never be a white country. The world is changing. The idea that the third world can be a bunch of garbage places and shithole countries, that's over. Hi. You know, so we have to think in new terms. Now, here's what happened. In the 20th century, we had the Soviet Union. That became the model for thinking beyond capitalism. And the Comintern and, you know, the world that led to the anti-colonial movements, etc. We all had great aspirations for the post-colonial experience, etc. Today, we don't have any models. Socialism is no longer state policy somewhere. What that means is we all have to think. We all have to study. We all have to take responsibility for the future. That's a hell of a responsibility. Now you take the average worker and you tell that worker, the working class has to take over and run the society. That is so opposite of anything that anybody is being taught, anybody is being oriented. And the first thing they're going to say is, well, no, these are people, they let them run it. They're the lawyers, they're the big men, you know. And so we've got a lot of work to do. And it's on us. But the other thing is that this future might not be tomorrow, might not be next year, could be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And as I said, I think we're heading into a period of barbarism. You know, words like immorality. I mean, this is a moment for us to think very hard about who we're up against. So when you think about Trump, see, one reaction just is, that's a fool, and, you know, he can't even get his hair straight, you know. But you should really be thinking about the type of system that is using Trump and allowing him to use the federal government as a cash register for his family. but there's something bigger going on. So all those tech billionaires that were sitting on the stage when he was inaugurated, those people, they're behind this. So we have to not just get caught up in Trump. It's a systemic thing. And guess what? They plan to rule forever. And you know what? Many of us are volunteering to help them. Why? We get on Facebook, we get on Twitter, we tell them all our business, all our secrets, all our family business, all of everything. And their algorithms are just drinking it in, and then using it. So now AI, they plan to take over education. Already a certain very large percentage of news reports are being written by this software they've developed. That's why they can fire all the people that work for the newspapers and so on.
All the more reason we need to be able to use it as well, though.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing. Evil doesn't come as bad taste. Evil comes with sugar. You know, so people like it. So, of course, it's useful. If it was in our hands, maybe. But I'm not so sure that what we want people to do is to not read books. You know, I mean, I'm not sure that we want AI to create the music. I think we want our kids to learn musical instruments and learn how to sing. I mean, we're human beings. And so AI is taking us away from our humanness and isolating us to have experiences. They're going to turn AI into sex. Now, maybe I'm old school. Anyway.
Thank you, Abdul. I was fascinated by your take on what's going on in the Caribbean. And I wanted to ask whether you think, given the atomization and insularity of those nation states and their vulnerability to manipulation and bullying, which is what Trump is doing down there right now, whether you believe that the African Union and its 6-region initiative, i.e., making the global African diaspora the 6th region of Africa, and seeing the diaspora as having a major role in the development not only of the continent, but of itself. Whether you believe that that, at this particular juncture, creates an opportunity for the Caribbean both to organize itself as the West Indies Federation tried to do all these, 60 years ago, and to be able to have a more effective voice within the African Union and its affairs. Because it seems to me that the Caribbean nations, the Caribbean region, has got to be bold enough to say, Monroe Doctrine or not, Trump Doctrine or not, we can divest ourselves of this dependency on the United States and look differently to how we might configure our relationship with Africa. Individual countries are doing that, again, in a pretty atomized kind of way. Grenada in relation to Nigeria, Jamaica and Ethiopia and whatever. I don't see that particularly being very helpful, especially as so many of those African countries themselves do not have a Pan-Africanist orientation.
Yeah. No, I thank you for the question, because I think the question really reflects the idea that unity of any groups of people or groups of countries is important to the extent that it increases the possibility of struggle within those individual countries. See, without the struggle within those countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa. Without those struggles, then these broader organizations, whether it's the African Union or any kind of Pan-African structure, will not be progressive. In other words, so in the Caribbean, the principal task, and this of course is the new economy, the principal task is what's happening within each country. Because when you talk about Caribbean nations joining in who is doing the joining? Who represents those countries? Who controls the newspapers interpreting to the population what's going on? And in Africa, I mean, we were active in the anti-colonial struggle for Africa. And we had such hopes, such aspirations, and there was such leadership, whether it was Nkrumah or Amilcar Cabral or the multiple people we could reference in South Africa, for that matter, Mugabe and Nkomo. You know, they were a certain kind of leadership that was against the colonial powers. What happened? Our aspirations were not met. And if I can say this, that includes Mandela. You know, so, but it's like I was saying before, got rid of one thing, got rid of colonialism, then we run into what Nkrumah called neo-colonialism.
Yeah.
Then get rid of imperialism. Now we got that brother in Burkina Faso. You know, there are other examples, but these are like, we have to believe, you know, what Mao said, a single spark can start a prairie fire. That's what we hope. We hope my man in Burkina Faso will inspire youth in other countries to begin to move in a direction. And we see that in some countries. We see that. What's happening in the Caribbean? You know, what's happening in Grenada? You know we had such hopes. Maurice was the hope. There was a whole generation, really, in people in different places, etc. But that's the issue. The issue is class struggle every goddamn where. And you can't escape that. And the first step is to expose the nature of the colonial work. That's why I have to give applause to Gus, because he relentlessly writes articles that appear in the newspaper in the Caribbean. How many of you all are actively studying and communicating exposés of how they rule so that we can begin to think about how to move beyond that, especially younger people? This is a moment when the actual turning point might be sometime in the future. We have to really prepare for that.
Yeah.
But thank you for the question. Yes.
That's hold it in front of me.
This whole thing right here.
Abdul, you raised the issue of immorality, and I have two questions, separate but equal. There's one individual general, you mentioned Winkleson, one individual general, when the first boat was bombed was shut out of the seas in Trinidad, off the coast of Trinidad, one African-American general resigned because he said that I am not in this army to murder people without justification. So where is the moral compass in American society? Because we're trying to get that here in Europe and in Africa.
Yeah.
So where is the moral compass at present? My second question is, you've identified class consciousness. Now, class consciousness in terms of workers in America has to also be looking at class consciousness in the region, in the Americas, South America, the Caribbean, Central America. So what is happening with class consciousness amongst workers in America that identifies with the class consciousness in the wider region?
Thank you. Well, to your first question about immorality and where is the population at this moment, one of the interesting things that has happened is the right-wing orientation of religion, so that the people in churches are taught that the goal of Trump is so important that you can accept his immorality. But that's what was happening with the Epstein struggle, that it just got to be too far. And these were little young white girls, you know, and so that became one of the reasons why we're at war. So there is that possibility of indicating to what extent the ruling class is immoral. That is directly connected to class consciousness, because these are people who are, we used to have to learn the word billionaire. Now we have to learn how to say trillionaire. So there are trillionaires in society, and there's sections of cities that are dancing around the golden calf, to use a biblical reference, you know, while mass suffering is going on and people are starving. Again, immorality. What's moral about that? And of course, that's part of the crisis that's happening in colleges and universities. Is how do you teach law or business and prepare people to be part of that kind of polarization? And to aspire to be part of that means, of course, you have to go along with the exploitation and oppression of people. It's not like independent. On the question of, it's a very interesting question of solidarity of workers, particularly in the United States, particularly true with the Latino population and immigrant workers from South America. Now, one of the things that happened, one of the first studies that we did in the Southern Workers Assembly is of meat packing. Because what has happened in the United States is meat packing has been decentralized. It used to be centralized, like in Chicago used to be a major center of meat packing, and all of the main meat companies were located there. The stockyards was there. The railroad brought animals in and then sent out processed meat products. That's decentralized. So that, and in a lot of these places, there were immigrant workers being hired. And then when the pandemic hit, those meatpacking places were one of the main centers of people getting sick. And so, and then later today, ICE is cherry picking people. So in both those instances of the pandemic and then the ICE raids, increasingly people are rising in support of their co-workers and so on. And that's raising consciousness about, well, why are these people here? How do they fit in society? The lies that Trump and them are saying, because we know these people, they're our neighbors, they're our co-workers. They're not enemies, they're not criminals. They contribute to society, et cetera, et cetera. So there are those examples of how class solidarity is developing. In the broader sense, however, independent of those immediate practical things, even Black people are not exactly internationalists when it comes to accepting immigrant workers and accepting solidarity with workers in other countries. And this is a heavy, heavy point, because if you go back to the period of the 60s, and whether it's SNCC or whether it's a Black Panther Party or whether it's the African Liberation Support Committee, or any number of other organizations that tried to develop this global solidarity and had direct relationships with people in these other countries. You know, Maurice was part of African Liberation Support Committee with us. You know, and the people who were students at Howard University and went back, there was great connection. That's not happening as much today. So we've got a lot of work to do in that respect. Yeah.
You touched on, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. You touched on the way that words are becoming inadequate, that we need to invent new terms, new epithets, and new language for certain things. I think the kind of conjunction to that, what accompanies it is the way that certain words are discredited and distorted and weaponized very, very quickly these days, and how those distortions take hold in popular consciousness and become these very twisted realities. So the obvious example is woke, how as an idea, it has great validity, but it's become this Trojan horse that the right wing and the far right use against the very idea of morality, decency, compassion, empathy, and the magnification of that, or certainly the real consequences of that, hit me when I recently went to Belgium, and I entered into conversation with somebody who I thought was a pretty intelligent, kind of upstanding person, and they said, well, I really like England, I really like the UK, but one of the biggest problems is the fact that you have something called le wokisme. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, oh, you have this idea of being woke. So I challenged him on it, and I said, what exactly do you mean? And he couldn't put forward a definition of it. So the language had become something other than what it was supposed to be originally. And I just see that happening time and time again, where the right wing manages to distort something, whether it's diversity, inclusion, equity, that these terms, which really have great meaning as principles, are trashed comprehensively. And that becomes part of the struggle as well, because I think language, certainly in the era of AI that we're in now, is of enormous importance. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to always talk about jazz.
So do I.
Because, you know, some people think that you could play an instrument, just pick it up and blow. And my understanding of the way in which most jazz musicians have historically developed is you use the study of what has preceded you. You play those changes, and then you develop your own voice. But you have to work through. And so I think that way about language. I'm really, frankly, old school. I want a study group and read Capital. I want to learn the language historically. But I also believe that when young people get a hold of something, they will naturally end up developing a way to express it in their colloquial understanding of how to make meaning real. And but I agree that, for example, the word revolution was taken over by Newt Gingrich, you know, and took it away from us. So we couldn't say revolution anymore. They were saying it. No, I mean, the battle of ideas. I, for example, think that the current system is evil. And I define that as being not good, not righteous, immoral, unjust, etc. But I recently said that to somebody, and they said, oh, well, we don't like that word evil. It doesn't mean anything. And to me, I was searching for the most terrible word I could finally get to say what I meant by talking about these assholes. You know, so terrorism, barbarism. I mean, this is, again, you know, now I've got to explain to somebody why it's okay to say evil. I can't allow the word evil to only be used by some religious tendencies that want to take us into a theology that we don't want to go to. You know, but I think the word devil means something. I think there are devils alive and well in society. You know, and unfortunately, they're running amok in the United States. But I take your point. I mean, it's the battle of ideas. We cannot assume that they should control anything. We have to contest everything. And even though it's tiresome and it's cumbersome, you know, and you know, I want to listen to some good music. You know, I want to look at pretty women. I want to eat good food, good wine, you know, and so on. But I mean, we have to fight. Yeah. No, you. Sorry about this, but.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you. Really, really insightful. Some of like the thoughts that you're putting out there. Just like trying to articulate how I feel. It's as a young person in today's society, it's the first time probably in my life that I've been disturbed by what I see out there in terms of like, and the term that I always think about, like corporate fascism, like what you said, what you saw, you know, in the Senate, you know, when he was getting inaugurated. And I've fallen out with my dad very, very badly over this, because what I see out there in the world I find extremely disturbing. The way we talk about people, the way we talk about death, you know, just fundamentally our connections with each other. And a thought for myself is like, how do I best protect myself, my community, and like my surroundings? Because I count myself very fortunate that, you know, I grew up in this part of London. I grew up in an extremely loving family. Like my grandparents migrated from Zimbabwe, and they provided a fantastic life for my nana, and then met my dad. And I've lived a good life, you know, being exposed to so much, and even in terms of my job, like I work in sport and I get so much fulfillment, but I can't help but to see so many other young people who are really struggling, who seem really disturbed, and they don't have like the outlet that I have through sport and that connection that I can still make with people, because I go outside and I have control of my body, so I think I have a better ability to control my mind. But I guess my question is like, how do you best create, I've had a few ideas, but how do you best create a community that can keep people connected? Because it does feel like everything's trying to atomize people and turn each other on each other, and it feels truly prevalent and like disturbing as a young person, and it's hard to focus and it's hard to plan my life like with my partner. It's really very, very difficult.
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you for speaking. One of the interesting things we people in my generation are desperately looking for is a handoff. You know, is to make a connection. I think the danger when we think of community is we think often beyond our own capacity, and that leads to a certain amount of disappointment that we can't achieve, when the opposite is actually the truth. Everything starts small. And so one person making a connection with one or two other people is collectivity. It's not just in numbers. See, there are two aspects of reality. One is quantitative and one is qualitative. And so they interact. And so if you think about the civil rights movement, 4 students started the sit-ins that led to a national movement. So just having 1 or 2 people, and that's what we're doing in workplace committees. We've got squads that go to workplaces, plant gates, and pass out leaflets and try to talk to people and get phone numbers and so on. And what we're looking for is what we call a militant minority, a small group of people in one plant, small group in another plant, small group in another plant, small group in another plant, come together and form an assembly, and then together begin to target other places. Another ways to put it is a single step is the way you do a 1,000-mile journey, and then the second step and the third step. So it's really important for you to be here. It's important for you to not leave here unless you make a contact with somebody else sitting around next to you or behind you. You might want to make a contact with Michael LaRose in the bookstore. You know, in other words, make this a step and then another step. And you might, through this place, meet some other young people. And then the conversation begins, you know, and it's not just about any given topic, because it's really about every topic. One of the things that is interesting about newspapers that are useful is every section of the newspaper is read by somebody. Yes. So an analysis of sports. As I understand it, I'm not a student on this, but as I understand it, C.L.R. James made a real contribution talking about sports. You know, and I'm sure some people said, what's sport got to do with anything? Well, you know why I hated coming over here to the book fair in March? I missed, exactly, I missed the basketball tournament. Anyway, I did it. But yeah, that's the thing. You know, you have to start small. That's community. And then together you imagine, and then you imagine, and then you work more, and then you find somebody else. Because what happened for the book fair? Small number of people here, then suddenly there was a small number of people in Manchester. Maybe there were 2 or 3 people in Bradford, you know, in Leeds, etc. And then suddenly that became a national connection. It didn't start out with 200 people. I know, because I saw some of them small groups, and they were powerful. And the reason they were powerful is because a vast majority of people were really looking for those small numbers of people because they had questions. Sure. And so you have to now prepare yourself with answers because we know the majority of people are going to have these questions. You know, one basic question is, what the hell is going on? How do you make sense of what the hell is going on? And so, yeah, make a connection.
Yeah, I've got some ideas. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Last one. I guess,
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Also, to the gentleman's question about community, I've only been here since last Wednesday, but I do feel overwhelmed with the people that I've talked to, and it makes you realize that the world is depending on us to get this right. The world. And so we can't just be worried about our own corners. I mean, we have to be worried about, the people around us. But, I've read Ruth Ben-Ghiat, the other gentleman who wrote the other book about fascism. And, they say that once you get to a critical mass, and maybe we're almost there, the next protest, which will be March 28th, if we get to 10 million, now that we've gotten one person booted out of the administration or wherever she is, that known lady. I mean, do you think that is the beginning of the end? I know what you're going to say, but I'm asking.
I think, one of the interesting things about these people, the ruling class, they intend to rule forever. They're not the most stupid people. We can't assume that we're not up against formidable situation. And so one of the things we learned when this guy, Clarence Thomas, was being discussed along with Anita Hill. And the man was being interviewed, and he talked about the number of people, these are black people, who come through the Ivy League colleges, who are part of the sort of minor leagues of the system, waiting until they're called upon. So there are many levels of leadership and bureaucracies that we're up against. Harold Washington, when he was elected mayor of Chicago, he said he had to be mayor for 20 years because of the way in which the system was structured. For example, in the property real estate section of City Hall, it wasn't organized A through Z. That would be rational. It was organized in a strange way that you had to join in as an intern, as part of the network of the people who were in control, to learn the system, because it was the control of property in the city. That's how they control money. Harold, one of the things he did when he computerized that department and made it more rational. But he died before he could change the system. What Trump and Musk did was attack federal workforce. And they removed the memory of the civil service and began to put in flunkies and ideologues to really destroy the federal government, which meant that they were turning things over to the states. So get rid of the the Department of Education for national standards and turn it over to the states. The CDC for the control of diseases and the vaccines, get rid of that. And so the states had to begin to organize. So are we changing the federal government? Are we losing a federal system? And we're going down now to groups of states that are getting together to create standards and organizational processes. That goes along with the possibility of a civil war. I mean, you're breaking up the country. So I'm not sure it's going to happen quickly. We might even be talking not in terms of years, but in terms of generations. In other words, this is really civilizational crisis. I mean, you know, what does that mean? I mean, you know what I mean? I'm trying to live for another 10 years, you know what I mean? But when you deal with that level of abstraction, where you start talking about a civilization, well, what did Rubio say in Munich?
Yeah.
He referred back to the 18th century.
Yes.
I mean, they'll tell it to you if we're listening and hearing what they're saying.
And he said to them, do not feel guilty for purported sins. That was a time, he said, when great things happened. People settled continents and crossed oceans. And we don't want you feeling sorry because we don't want weak allies. I really, really listened to that speech. Yes. And I urge you to find it online and listen to it, because you will understand exactly where we are. It is terrifying. And we have to take a breath and continue the work.
See, the other thing is, he could say that, but we could still listen to Bob Marley.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we can still listen to James Brown.
Yeah.
You know, and we can watch James Brown dance. You know what I mean? And if he could do that, we can win.
Yeah.
We have to interpret our strengths.
Yes.
You know what I mean? See, I went to college, I went to graduate school, and I had to constantly make a judgment that their standards weren't the only standards by which we can envision the future being created. We had to look somewhere else.
Yeah, it's not the standard.
But that's the struggle over culture. That's the struggle over aesthetics, beauty. It's a struggle over logic, you know. And like I said, I mean, in the end, support New Beacon. It's an oasis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Before I go, just wanted to say this has been a very important presentation, and the power of it is when we discuss with each other, because the next steps that Abdul is talking about is us doing things together, and that's the only way we can resist what is coming and what is here. New Beacon is happy as part of our way we organize, to organize events like this because of its importance of exchange. And we have no better person than Abdul to stimulate us and get us thinking about the things we should be doing in the future because of what we face. Please thank Abdul Alkalimat.